I really appreciate two of you bringing the issue to the fore. I just want to go a little deeper around how this government and its various minions have affected this province and this country, because we also can't forget that the in the mid-90s in Ontario, the Harris government brought in an omnibus bill. And right at the top of the list, one of the first things they cut was counseling for men who batter women. This was a tiny amount of money. Like, wow, like you even found that? And I was like, well, what's that about? I mean, I'd heard the, the beer and pretzels theory and how, most moms are just out there to like, I don't know, they got pregnant by accident, and really they just want to drink beer, and so they don't need welfare and blah, 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 right? I'd heard that. But I was like, what's this attacking this little program for male batterers, And then I started hearing from women in the shelter movement or the shelter system that Mike Harris's ex had been a battered woman in the shelter system. So I foolishly spouted out in a meeting one day that was being recorded for the radio that Harris beat his wife. And it went on the radio. And I wake up the next day and I'm listening and there's me on the radio saying that. I'm like, ooh, uh-oh, oh dear. Being outspoken is one thing, but that's maybe libel, right? Nothing ever happened. So, pretty obvious what's going on there, right? I met Mr. Harris before he was premier, and I was pretty creeped out. Yep, and I know a lot of people in North Bay. I know a lot of poor women in North Bay, and they were pretty creeped out. I've known a lot of women all over this province for a long time. I've been in contact with a lot of poor women, and I think that that gives me a very unusual perspective into the reality of women's lives in Canada, because we are, I'm in and out of poverty, but those of us who have lived in poverty as women or living in poverty as women are amongst some of the most invisible people on the planet. We actually, we live in the best country in the world, right? So obviously we couldn't have any problems. We're this wonderful democracy where, gender equity is like a really important thing and blah, blah, blah. So obviously we couldn't have any problems, right? And then when you look at the statistics and everything else, well, it's only 24% of single moms who are, struggling in poverty. And it's only 14% of old women who, are like starving to death. So that's not so bad, right? We don't really have any problems. But you don't maybe know so much about how they don't aggregate the poverty statistics, how there's just thousands upon thousands of women missing. Like, for example, isn't it interesting that we know, all of us, anybody, even the most least informed Canadian understands that the conditions for Aboriginal women would be worse than for many women around the world, and they're very close to conditions in the South. But they're not counted in poverty statistics. What, are they on a different planet? Like, what's up, right? So you look closely at how these issues are unpacked and analyzed in the official sort of zones of formal research and such, we're missing a lot of reality. And the other thing that we're missing, and this is something that really came home to me, because after Harris got elected, I realized that it was pretty much futile to try to get anything to change here. Like, everything we'd fought for was gone. The housing thing that we were about to build so I could move my family into it was gone. All this stuff, gone, gone, gone. So I'm like, oh yeah, you know what, this is a global problem. And this is when I really realized you got to go global to local. Like, the forces that are creating these things, NAFTA, everything else, these are global issues that are being pushed by a global corporate agenda, and the people's movements have to go global as well. So that has been happening, and that's great. But in the process, as a North American or Canadian being engaged in that as a grassroots activist, I was constantly encountering this idea that, the Canadians were there to help everybody else, and we didn't have any problems, right? So I get into this interesting dialogues with people from absolutely devastated places, and it's kind of challenging, right? It's like, well, actually, you know what? We're kind of poor too. They're like, come on, you're kidding, right? But it got more and more easy to prove and more obvious, and it has become incredibly obvious if you look hard enough when you realize that, it's very, very rare that any woman was ever homeless in this country. Now there are thousands upon thousands of thousands, and they're not counted properly either. You hear about shelter visits, but they don't all go to shelters, right? So you hear, one night there's 11,000 women in the shelters in Toronto. You're like, what the hell is that about? Because if there's 11,000 in shelters, there's a whole bunch who aren't, right? And you start looking into that, digging into that, and as I said, I knew a lot of women around the country, and I get phone calls from women, hiding out, living in their car. And they don't want anybody to know that they're poor, because in their small town, there's a grand intolerance towards poverty. So if you have the nerve to even admit that you're poor, you're going to get shunned, isolated, and cut out. So you're obviously not going to advocate, right? And if you're a new immigrant, a new Canadian, you've come here, you know, you've managed to like get everybody's life savings together to come here so you could send back remittances and your whole family's counting on you, and you've come with your higher education, and the people from the embassy said, oh yeah, you can come here and get a great job, everything's going to be tickety-boo, your kids will be wonderful, blah, 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 and you end up in St. Jamestown, you're hungry, you ain't got enough food, you can't get more than $3 an hour in the local fish store, and your kid's on crack? Are you going to tell anybody? Are you going to like talk about that? And like, who's going to listen to you in the media when that reality is going on? And as I started spending more time in my own community, I was sort of doing this local to global thing. I'm like, okay, I got the most diverse community in the world. Let's see how this plays out when I go to Thailand. I'm going to talk to some Thai people when I get home. You know what I'm saying? And I was like making those links. I was pretty appalled, really appalled. I mean, painfully appalled to realize the level of suffering that goes on around us daily. But we have so much material wealth in this country that we can't see it. It's easier to get decent secondhand clothes than it is to get nutritious food, right? And it's a lot easier to walk along the street for a short space in your half-decent clothes and look like everything's all right than it is to actually figure out what the hell to do when you've got zero stability, zero security, when you can't get any help or defense when you're being beaten and you're from a different culture that doesn't want to like allow you to leave that situation. Or when you do go into the system and engage in the system and what? They take women's children because she didn't have the wit to not get beaten in front of them. Those children were exposed to violence, now we're going to take the kids? There's another little statistic we all got to look into. Why is the state taking so many children from women? Why can't they just give them a subsidized bloody housing unit like they did my family so we could survive? They spread them out and they take their children. Some of them they adopt out. That's a nice, cushy profit motive for you. Some of them just go into the system. And isn't it interesting that that same system, where they don't take care of maternal health when women are older and they're now taking care of older children, that you think it doesn't matter if mom's not around when the teenager's growing up, when her daughter hitting puberty? Of course it does. But now she's working 3 jobs to keep food on the table, right? So isn't it convenient that either the state-sponsored child or the child living in a household where both parents or one parent is working so much they don't even see their kids, and those kids end up in the juvenile justice system, surprise, surprise. And isn't it interesting that, you know, it's okay to like play 50 Cent in hip hop and let him come up here and tell them all to get involved in crime, but don't let dead president over the border, right? To talk about empowerment, you know what I'm saying? So, you know, I have black sons. I'm sorry, this is a very soft spot for me, all right? But it's very interesting for those of us who are women of color whose sons go through this system, and daughters, because they go into a system that is now making profit from their behavior, from their criminal behavior. They not only make profit from running the juvenile jails, and we know there's private prisons and such in this country, but us mothers have to sit there and realize what they've done is created a big, cheap labor force for themselves, because those prisoners become basically slave labor for corporations. So this is how deep everything goes. So we talk about maternal health, and it's not just, you know, can you pop out a healthy baby, because obviously somebody's got to take care of that baby, right? And when that baby hits puberty and something's starting to move forward and they're going to like make their decisions on what kind of an adult they're going to be, you want family, you want mother and father around, but that's almost impossible now. And that's something that's really important. None of us, none of you can ever do enough to make change when we have no time. And isn't it fascinating how people's time that they have any freedom to do anything constructive has dwindled to almost nothing. And what the brother here was saying about human rights, I want us to remember that. Canada was one of the initiators of human rights law, all right? And those human rights laws appeal to people all around the planet, but we happen to be the most ignorant population about those rights. Why? Because we happen to be the population that could probably do the most about those rights, because we can communicate with the entire world. We can blow the lid off the bullshit in North America. We can talk about the reality of poverty right here in the so-called wealthiest society, and we can help the rest of the world understand this is a really crappy model. And the reason it's really crappy is that even in the place where it's supposed to be working the best, the fact that the economic system refuses to acknowledge the value of women, refuses to acknowledge the value of being with your family and your children, refuses to acknowledge health and everything else, has no value in anything we need. That's why nothing works. And until we change that, it's not going to change.